The story of the haunted house of John Amos is one that still gives people chills, and while John Amos himself is a figure of fiction, the eerie tale surrounding his residence is told as if it were real. The house, located in a quiet, old neighborhood in New Orleans, was once owned by Amos, a well-known man in his time, but after his untimely and mysterious death, it became notorious for its unsettling energy. In the years following his death, the house remained empty for a long time, with rumors swirling about its haunted nature. No one seemed brave enough to move in, as the house's reputation grew. Whispers of strange sounds, flickering lights, and even shadowy figures lurking in the windows. Some said they could feel John's presence, still lingering in the halls, as if he never truly left. That is until the new owners arrived. A young couple, fresh to the city, seeking a home with character, bought the house after being charmed by its vintage architecture and potential for restoration. They didn't know much about the house's past but found it intriguing and full of promise. It was a bargain almost too good to be true, and they quickly signed the papers, eager to start their new life there. First, everything seemed perfect. They began renovating the house, uncovering old artifacts hidden in the walls and learning more about the house's history. But as time went on, strange things began happening. They started hearing footsteps on the upper floors when no one was there, and late at night, they could feel a cold presence watching them from the shadows. One evening, while walking through the attic, they found an old journal belonging to John Amos himself. The pages were filled with accounts of his life, his thoughts, and some disturbing entries about his own experiences with the supernatural. The couple soon realized that the house wasn't just an old property with a past. It was alive with it. Every night, the house seemed to shift, like it was never the same place twice. Doors would open and close on their own, and the strange noises grew louder. It wasn't long before they started seeing a figure in the corner of their eyes, always watching, always lingering. The figure had the distinct features of John Amos, a man in a dark suit, with eyes that seemed to pierce straight into their souls. As they tried to live their normal lives, they couldn't escape the growing sense of dread. The house felt like it was slowly consuming them, pulling them deeper into its grip, and they realized they were not just haunted by the memories of its previous owner, but by the very energy that he had left behind. The new owners, desperate for answers, began reaching out to paranormal experts and historians, but it seemed like the house had no interest in being understood. With every attempt to uncover the truth, the supernatural occurrences only intensified. Eventually, the couple made the difficult decision to leave. They couldn't live in a house that was so deeply tied to the supernatural, haunted by a presence they couldn't explain or escape. They left in the middle of the night, leaving everything behind: furniture, memories, and even the journal. To this day, the house stands as a symbol of mystery and the unknown. The new owners may have fled, but it's said that the presence of John Amos still lingers, waiting for the next family to come and uncover his story or become part of it. The house stood like a silent sentinel, its darkened windows staring out at the quiet street. The faded paint on the exterior, peeling in some places, gave it an air of neglect, but its charm was undeniable. Time seemed to pass differently here, as though the very walls of the house held memories of events that had happened long ago, memories that still clung to the air, like the dust that settled over everything. The once grand front porch sagged, its rocking chairs swaying in the wind with a rhythm that seemed almost too deliberate, like an invitation to those who would listen. For weeks after the young couple left, the house remained abandoned, its silence a stark contrast to the restless energy that had once filled it. Yet, despite its emptiness, it never felt quite alone. Every so often, a passerby would notice the faint flicker of a light from within, though the house was supposedly vacant. Some thought it was just their imagination, a trick of the eye, but others swore they saw shadows moving behind the curtains. The eerie nature of the house began to spread throughout the neighborhood, adding to the lore of John Amos and his troubled past. It wasn't long before new owners came forward. A family, eager to start fresh in a place that held mystery and history in equal measure, found themselves drawn to the house. They had heard the rumors, of course, but to them, the legends felt like nothing more than old tales meant to scare children. The house was beautiful, full of potential, and perhaps a little too inexpensive given its age and condition. They were not a superstitious family. They saw only opportunity where others saw doom. They moved in without hesitation, the thrill of new beginnings outweighing any lingering doubts about the stories that had been told. The family consisted of a mother and father, their teenage daughter, and a younger son who was far more excited about the house than anyone else. His fascination with the old woodwork, the creaking floors, and the antique furniture left behind by the previous occupants was palpable. He imagined adventures in every room, every corner a new discovery. The first few days passed without incident. They unpacked boxes, cleaned the rooms, and painted the walls to make the house their own. It was a task of joy, a way to breathe life back into the old structure. The father spent most of his time in the basement, where he set up his workshop, while the mother focused on redecorating the living room. The children explored, often retreating to the attic, which seemed to hold a strange allure for them. It was filled with forgotten trinkets and dusty furniture. But there was something else there, something the children couldn't quite put into words. One night, after a particularly long day of cleaning, the family sat down to dinner in the dining room. The wooden table creaked under the weight of their plates, and the chandelier above them flickered slightly, as if reacting to their presence. As they ate, the air in the room seemed to grow heavier. The walls, once warm and welcoming, now felt cold, as though something had settled in between them. The family tried to brush it off, attributing the chill to a draft or an old house settling, but deep down, they all felt it, the oppressive weight of something watching them. It was the mother who first heard the sound. A soft tapping, like a gentle knock, coming from the hallway just outside the dining room. She paused, her fork halfway to her mouth, listening intently. The father looked up, puzzled, but heard nothing. The tapping came again, louder this time, and then stopped abruptly. The mother excused herself and went to investigate, her footsteps echoing in the silent house. She checked every room along the hallway, but nothing seemed out of place. No one was there. As the days passed, the odd occurrences began to pile up. The father, who was once skeptical of the house's haunted reputation, started hearing strange noises at night, scratching sounds, like nails against the wood, coming from the walls. He would wake in the middle of the night, feeling a cold presence beside his bed, though no one was there. The daughter, an avid reader of paranormal stories, began to feel a sense of unease when she was alone in her room. She claimed to have seen shadows moving across her walls, figures that would appear and disappear in the corner of her eye. But it was the son who was the most affected. One evening, while playing with his toys in the attic, the boy came across something strange. Behind a pile of old boxes, he discovered a wooden chest, its surface etched with intricate designs. It was locked, but the boy, curious as ever, managed to pry it open. Inside, he found a collection of old photographs, some of which were clearly decades old, and a small, leather-bound book. The book was worn, its pages yellowed with age, and though the handwriting was nearly illegible, the boy felt an odd compulsion to read it. As he flipped through the pages, he began to recognize some of the names that seemed to match those of the house's previous occupants, including John Amos. The more he read, the more the house seemed to come alive around him. The air grew thick, and the temperature dropped so suddenly that the boy could see his breath. He heard whispers, faint at first, then louder, as though someone were speaking directly into his ear. Panic set in, and he rushed down the attic stairs, the book clutched tightly in his hands. His family, unaware of what he had just discovered, brushed off his frantic behavior as childish imagination. But the boy knew something had changed. The house was no longer just a home, it was a place that held something dark, something ancient. And as the nights grew longer and the whispers louder, the family began to understand that their new home was far more than they had bargained for. It was a place where the past refused to stay buried, where the spirit of John Amos and the shadows of those before him were still very much alive, lingering in the corners, waiting for the next chapter in the house's long, troubled history. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The boy's breathing was shallow as he clutched the small leather-bound book to his chest, his fingers trembling against its worn cover. He could still hear the whispering, not in words but in murmurs, indistinct and hollow, like voices calling from beneath the floorboards. The house felt different now, not just eerie, not just unsettling, but alive in a way that made his skin crawl. The walls, the floor, even the air itself seemed to vibrate with something unseen. The boy didn't tell his parents what had happened in the attic. He knew they wouldn't believe him. Instead, he hid the book beneath his mattress and tried to forget the way the shadows had twisted in the dim attic light, the way the cold had wrapped around him like a living thing. But the house did not let him forget. That night, as the rest of the family slept, the boy lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The room was too quiet, the silence pressing against his ears until it was almost unbearable. Then, just as he began to drift off, there was a sound. A slow, deliberate creaking of wood. A footstep. His heartbeat stuttered. The house had many old boards, and he had grown used to the random groans and shifts of the structure as it settled in the night. But this was different. This was not the house breathing on its own. This was movement. Another step. Closer. The boy squeezed his eyes shut, his breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps. He tried to convince himself it was just his imagination, that his mind was playing tricks on him after what had happened in the attic. But then he heard it again, closer this time, right outside his door. And then a whisper, not the vague murmurs from the attic, but something clearer, something intentional. Come upstairs. The voice was dry, brittle, like dead leaves scraping across pavement. The boy's body froze, his pulse pounding in his ears so loudly, he thought it might drown out the sound completely. But the silence that followed was even worse. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. He didn't dare. Then, slowly, the doorknob began to turn. A quiet, metallic click, followed by the soft groan of the door inching open. He stared at the darkness beyond, unable to see anything, but feeling something standing there, watching. He turned his face into the pillow and squeezed his eyes shut so tightly that colors bloomed behind his eyelids. He didn't sleep that night. He barely breathed. And when the first light of dawn crept into the room, the door was still slightly open. The next morning, the house seemed almost normal again. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting golden beams across the wooden floors. His mother hummed as she made coffee. His father shuffled through the newspaper, and his sister scrolled through her phone at the breakfast table, oblivious to the restless night he had endured. But the boy felt it, the weight of the house pressing down on him. He ate his cereal in silence, his spoon clinking against the bowl, his mind drifting back to the attic, to the book he had found, to the name scrawled inside the cover in uneven, jagged handwriting. John Amos. His hands tightened around the spoon. He needed to go back up there. He didn't want to, but he had to. The house wasn't finished with him yet. The attic door loomed before him, its old wooden surface scarred with years of scratches and dents, as if something had once tried to claw its way out. The boy stood at the bottom of the narrow staircase leading up to it, his breath slow, measured, as if the house itself was waiting for him to make his move. The air here was different, heavier, as though it carried the weight of something unseen, something that had been left behind. It was silent, but not the kind of silence that brought peace. It was the absence of sound that made the world feel hollow, like the house was holding its breath along with him. He swallowed hard. The book was still hidden beneath his mattress, its presence gnawing at the edges of his mind. He had spent the entire day trying to convince himself that last night had been nothing but a dream, a trick of exhaustion, but deep down, he knew better. The voice had been real. The footsteps had been real. And now, something in the attic was waiting for him. He placed one foot on the first step. The wood let out a long, slow creak beneath his weight, the kind of sound that seemed to stretch endlessly in the stillness of the house. He hesitated, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting something to stop him. But the hallway behind him was empty, bathed in the dim glow of the late afternoon sun. Another step. The shadows along the walls seemed to shift, stretching longer than they should, bending in ways that defied the angle of the light. He kept his eyes forward, refusing to acknowledge the growing sense of wrongness curling at the edges of his vision. By the time he reached the top of the stairs, his hands were slick with sweat. The attic door was closed, just as it had been before. He stood there for a moment, listening. The silence was unbearable, pressing into his ears until he thought he could hear his own heartbeat echoing in the walls. Then just barely a sound. Faint rustling, like fabric brushing against wood. His fingers trembled as he reached for the doorknob, the cold metal sending a shiver up his spine. He turned it slowly, feeling the resistance of an old mechanism long accustomed to being undisturbed. The door groaned as it swung open, revealing the dimly lit attic beyond. The space was exactly as he had left it, dust motes drifting in the slanted beams of light filtering through the small, grimy window. Stacks of forgotten boxes leaned against one another, their edges softened by age. The rocking chair in the corner stood still, its curved back silhouetted against the far wall. But something felt different. The air smelled heavier, tinged with something old and faintly metallic, like rusted iron. His eyes darted to the far side of the attic, to the chest. It was still there, exactly where he had found it before, its lid slightly ajar. But now something was different. The book. It was no longer inside. His pulse hammered in his ears as he stepped forward, his legs stiff with hesitation. He knew, without needing to check, that the book was no longer under his mattress. He could feel its absence like an open wound. He approached the chest slowly, each step deliberate, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The attic was silent, but the silence felt too deep, as if it was listening to him, waiting for him to make the wrong move. Then, from somewhere behind him, a whisper, a breath against his ear. "You shouldn't have come back." The boy spun around, his heart slamming against his ribs. The attic was empty, but the shadows along the walls had shifted, and the rocking chair was moving. The rocking chair moved with a slow, deliberate rhythm, its wooden base scraping against the attic floor in a sound so faint it barely disturbed the heavy silence. The boy's breath hitched in his throat. He could feel something watching him, not with eyes, but with presence, a weight in the air, a pressure in his chest. He wanted to run, wanted to turn and flee down the stairs, but his legs wouldn't obey. The attic held him in place. The whisper still lingered in his ears, dry and brittle, like something long dead struggling to speak. His skin prickled as the shadows stretched along the walls, shifting unnaturally, bending in ways that made no sense. The light from the single attic window dimmed as if something unseen was pressing against it from the outside, filtering out the sun. And then the temperature dropped. A deep, bone-chilling cold settled around him, creeping into his fingers, his neck, his lungs. The rocking chair creaked again, slower this time, as if whoever or whatever had been sitting in it had just risen. The boy swallowed hard. He needed to move. With every ounce of courage he could muster, he forced his legs to take a step back. The floor groaned beneath his weight, loud in the oppressive silence. He turned toward the door, toward escape, but before he could take another step, the door slammed shut. The sound echoed through the attic, sending dust swirling in the dim light. The boy whirled around, heart pounding, hands shaking. He reached for the doorknob, but the moment his fingers brushed against the cold brass, the book was there. It sat in the center of the attic floor, open to a page near the middle, its yellowed pages fluttering as though touched by an unseen hand. The ink was smeared in places, faded in others, but he could still make out the words. "He sees me now." The boy's stomach twisted. The handwriting, it wasn't the same as before. The letters were jagged, frantic, written by someone in a hurry. He turned the page with trembling fingers. "I tried to leave, but he won't let me go. The house belongs to him now." A breath of wind stirred the dust, though the attic had no vents, no openings. The boy's eyes darted across the page, searching for something, anything that would explain what was happening. And then the final entry. The ink was darker here, fresher somehow, as if the words had been written only moments ago. "He is behind me." The boy's entire body stiffened. His breath stopped. He didn't want to turn around, but something deep inside him told him he had no choice. Slowly, with agonizing slowness, he turned his head. The attic was darker than before, the shadows deeper, heavier. And there, standing just beyond the reach of the dim light, a figure, tall, motionless, dressed in dark clothes that seemed to blend into the blackness around him. The boy couldn't see his face, but he could feel his eyes, watching, waiting. The boy tried to move, tried to scream, but his voice caught in his throat. The figure took a step forward. The shadows curled around him like living things. The boy stumbled backward, his foot catching on the edge of the old chest. He hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the breath from his lungs. The book tumbled from his hands, landing open beside him. His vision blurred for a moment, his mind spinning. When he looked up, the figure was gone. The attic was still. The shadows had returned to normal. The cold had lifted, but something had changed. The house no longer felt like it was merely haunted. Felt claimed. The boy scrambled to his feet, grabbed the book, and bolted for the door. This time, it opened without resistance, swinging wide as if it had never been locked at all. He didn't question it. He ran. Down the stairs, through the hallway, past the kitchen where his mother stood washing dishes, oblivious to the terror clawing at his chest. He burst through the front door, into the blinding light of day, and didn't stop running until the house was a distant shape behind him. He never went back. His family stayed in the house for another month. Strange things continued to happen, doors opening on their own, objects moving from one place to another, whispers in the middle of the night. But nothing as terrifying as what had happened in the attic. Then, one morning, without any warning, his parents announced they were leaving. They never gave a reason. They simply packed their things, locked the doors, and never spoke of the house again. For years, the boy, now a man, tried to forget. But sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, he still hears the creak of a rocking chair, still feels unseen eyes watching from the dark. And sometimes, when he dreams, he finds himself standing at the foot of those attic stairs once more. And the voice, dry and brittle, like dead leaves in the wind, whispers his name. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.